Love it. Love it. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm recording this tonight, so for the people who might not be able to be here, my name is Tracy Heilers. I'm founder of Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully, and we've been around about 4 years. We're a 501c3 nonprofit supporting educators in lots of different ways, supporting the mindfulness education movement that's been emerging across this nation and across the world. And I connected with Barnaby right away at the start, and together this coalition idea, the spark began, and we've been growing since then. So when I was talking with our operational team about some ideas to do this school year.
They're meeting right now.
You need to mute yourself, Hector.
We'll do a few. Oh, hope I muted the wrong person.
Oops. No worries.
That's all right. Yeah, so Barnaby had, when I asked if he had any ideas for like mindfulness fundamental series, because we like to do some of that each year for personal development, he had this great idea for this Praxis series. And so we're going on the ride with him this year. I'll pass it over to you, Barnaby, and I'm going to just be the tech person. I'm going to be learning with everybody. I'll put some things in the chat, like if you're an educator who's wanting to earn clock hours, I'll put some links for how to do that and to fill out the attendance form. Help if they want to do breakout rooms. However it leads, I will be here to support.
Well, thank you, Tracy, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Barnaby Spring. We're here in the name of a very interesting topic or title. Let me just tell you how the Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully. Tracy's a parent living in Chicago. I'm an educator working primarily through the New York City Department of Education. We meet at a conference. She wants to do something around cultivating mindfulness on a greater level, particularly rooted in the Midwestern part of the country, as she lives outside of Chicago. This is some years ago. And she's a parent, but she's incredibly dynamic and very good on the ground. And I'm saying, why don't you just go? She wants to have a conference. And I say, why don't you just create an organization? She said, sure, why not? And so now we have this international organization called the Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully. Now, that's what it is. And what it's grounded in is really the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who you might be familiar with. He developed mindfulness-based stress reduction. He took whatever people were calling meditation or transcendental meditation or this or that, and he put it within the container of inquiry, the laboratory. What is this in its essence, in terms of a scientific evidence-based approach to helping people develop the capacity to self-regulate, developing the capacity to maintain attentional focus, and even deeper, what are the benefits of it within a medical model? And that's what he did. He created mindfulness-based stress reduction and is continuing to develop. His definition of mindfulness is paying attention on purpose. So paying attention on purpose in a particular way to what arises in the present moment without judgment. I love saying it out loud. I think sometimes just saying that, helps me. Paying attention on purpose in a particular way to what emerges in the present moment without judgment. And in the light of what's happening in the world, do we see a lot in our common spaces, our public spaces, in our discourse, in our dialogue? Do we see adults, forget the kids for now, but it's sort of unfair to expect the kids to have this capacity, but do we see adults having the capacity to pay attention on purpose in a particular way without judging. And it seems like something that's extremely, increasingly difficult for us to do, particularly in terms of what we see happening in the world. So I proposed this series to Tracy and to call it a Praxis series. So I want to qualify Praxis. I'm building my way up to what we're going to have happening tonight when we start having a conversation with James Hart, Jim Hart, who's here, but who also has some skin in the game around this. And we'll get to that. But Praxis, as defined by Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, described praxis as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. That's it. He argued that it was not enough for people to study the world. They also had a responsibility to act, to create a more just world. For Freire, praxis was a central defining feature of human life and a necessary condition of freedom. And he argued that human nature is expressed through intentional, reflective, meaningful activity, situated within dynamic historical and cultural contexts that shape and set limits on that activity. You could just make that a mindfulness practice right now. In fact, I would invite us, since when I came back onto the screen, I saw Tracy sort of just doing that. Let's say that again, only let's use it as a little bit of a mindfulness, an entry into this. Wherever you are, however you are, the invitation would be to simply come to a place of relaxed stillness and silence. No, you don't need to close your eyes necessarily or sit up straight. You can put your feet flat on the ground, you can, or you can have an extent. But, you know, many of the teachers these days at this point are just saying, can you allow stillness? Can you allow silence to be in the space wherever you are? You know, can I? And just allow a couple breaths. Just take a couple breaths, breathe. And use that simple experience as the medicine to be still, to allow stillness, to be silent, to allow silence. And then the invitation would be to focus your mind on this simple act of breathing, to notice how you breathe. How does the breath come in to your body? Through your nose, into your chest, into your belly? What moves when you inhale? Paying attention on purpose in a particular way. Our particular way is to use the breath. On purpose is when you set aside time to simply allow stillness, allow silence. It's not be quiet. It's not sit still. It's you don't have to conjure it up. It's right there. And as you are holding that space, let me read this again. Praxis, reflection, and action upon the world in order to transform it. It's not enough for people to study the world, we also have a responsibility to act, to create a more just world. Praxis is a central defining feature of human life and a necessary condition of freedom. We must act, we must reflect on our action to inform our action. And Freire argues that human nature is expressed through intentional, reflective, meaningful activity situated within dynamic historical and cultural context that shape and set limits on that activity. And you could breathe and notice what occurs to you in your own mind, in your own heart, in your own body, in relationship to that, without judgment. Now, maybe Jim will tell us, maybe this is almost a little bit of the place where somebody like Dr. Robert Coles was coming from in the beginning, maybe he was able to be there like that, last month. So this is session 2, the last session, and it's recorded and you can see it. We focused on mindfulness and creative improvisation in relation to finding groundbreaking solutions to seemingly overwhelming challenges. And we used Keith Jarrett's seminal work, The Colon Concert. Anybody remember The Colon Concert, that seminal work and the story behind that incredible thing? Well, that's what we focused on. And the ways in which Keith Jarrett, in his own way, used a natural sense of mindfulness as a tool for paying attention. Now we keep on talking about paying attention, and Simone Weil, the great French activist, once said that paying attention is the most generous thing that one human being can do for another. And of course, Simone Weil was one of the many people who inspired Robert Coles. Who is this guy? I keep on mentioning this guy. Who's Robert Coles? He's a professor emeritus of psychiatry and medical humanities at Harvard Medical School. He's the author of many books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning series, Children of Crisis, The Moral Intelligence of Children, and the Spiritual Intelligence of Children. I didn't know who Dr. Robert Coles was in 1990, 91. I was a young man living in Manhattan, beginning to think about, okay, I want to go a little bit deeper in my own praxis. I was an actor at the time, but I had an eye on what was happening in public education. And if you float around enough coffee shops in Manhattan on the Upper West Side, you're going to bump into Jim Hart in those days. Who was he then? I know he was a writer then. He was a friend of William Kennedy, I believe, the writer from upstate New York. You're going to correct me on that. And he was a thinker and a writer. And he was also teaching a course with Robert Coles. And he told me I should reach out to Coles. So I want to highlight the work of Robert Coles, who did incredible things. One of the things he did was he helped Ruby Bridges, who crossed that picket line and go to school, to stay focused and to understand what was happening for her when she went to school. He also taught an incredible course at Harvard University, many other things. And as I got to know Jim, I knew how integrated he was to doing work with Robert Coles. When he started Double Take Magazine, Jim was the CEO, I believe, the executive director of that incredible photojournalistic publication that was winning tons of awards. incredible work on documentary studies, paying attention. And this session really is about how does mindfulness of story help us to live into the story that wants to be for us as people. So this is a mindfulness practice that we're in right now, and I'm inviting you, friends, students, interested folks, to just join me in holding a space and paying attention for maybe what might emerge between Jim and I as I invite Jim now to move into the situation. Go, Jim. The overall title of this thing is What's Really Going On Here? What's going on here, Jim? I think that was basically the question that I had for you then. What's really going on here? You're on mute. You have to unmute.
I'm sorry. I was just thinking as I was thinking about Robert Coles, and I had never used this analogy before, but talking about Robert Coles and what he's about and what his interests are, I think would be a little like trying to qualify what who Benjamin Franklin was. Robert Coles is a psychiatrist. He's a civil rights activist. He's an esteemed teacher. He's one of the gurus and in many ways founder of a kind of an American investigation of documentary studies. And then he's a father and a husband and so on, and a great friend to many people. The other thing about Robert Coles, speaking of mindfulness, it's a little counterintuitive because Robert Coles, in a certain way, was extremely mindful, but also extremely opportunistic when accidents happened in his life.
Mm.
So he starts off in a family where his mother and father read aloud every night in the living room. Now, I can tell you from my working class family, that was not taking place. But they would read, especially the classics, but I think Tolstoy and Chekhov are two that come to mind. And this kind of drove Bob and his brother crazy because, who wants to listen to them at the age of 10 or whatever? Anyway, so he goes through his life and he winds up as a senior at Harvard. And this, I think, is very important about mindfulness. So it's like 1952 or 3 or something. And he does his senior thesis on William Carlos Williams, who no one is paying any attention to in academia at this time, or very few. And he does, and his thesis director says, "Boy, that's good." He said, "Why don't you send it to Dr. Williams?" Dr. Williams was a family doctor in Paterson, New Jersey, also one of the great American poets, it turned out. Anyway, Bob sends him this thesis that he wrote, and Dr. Cole, and he writes back to Cole, sends him a note and says, "Not bad for a kid from Harvard. You actually understood something." William Carlos Williams was very much an anti-intellectual, or certainly anti-intellectual establishment. Anyway, Coles comes to see. Coles says, he said, and Williams says, "Come to see me when you're in New York. Next time you're in New York." Well, of course, Coles gets on the next bus and goes to Paterson, New Jersey, and hangs out with Williams. And he spends 2 days going on his rounds with him and so on. And whatever, it was back when doctors did home visits and all that. And anyway, they get done with the 2 days, and Coles, I'm sure timidly, says, "Dr. Williams, what about my paper and my literary life?" And William says, what? You're pretty literally, just don't do that. He said, do something important. And Cole says, what do you mean? He said, you should become a physician. And Cole says, I've never taken a science course. And William says, don't worry, I can get you into Columbia Medical School. And that's how, essentially how Coles becomes a doctor. And I'm talking about this because this is an accident which Coles then turns into a life. He goes to medical school, and these wild things happen to him. You know, he's in the emergency room one night at probably Metropolitan Hospital or Columbia Pres, and they save a Black woman who's OD'd. And the doctors and the woman is very thankful to Dr. Coles particularly. And the woman says, why don't you come and see me? I'm a singer. And so Cole says, oh, great. And so the other doc in the room says, you don't know who she is, do you? Bob said, no. And he said, that was Billie Holiday. And you know, Coles then becomes a friend of Billie Holiday. I mean, this life goes on in this very mindful way in terms of the accidents. So then the next sort of, you can interrupt me at any time.
I'm loving it.
Okay. I just want to give a sense of Coles.
Yeah.
It's so hard to get a bead on.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that.
So anyway, then he's in the Air Force, I think it is. He's a psychiatrist in the Air Force. He's assigned to somewhere near New Orleans, and so he's going to a psychiatric conference, and he's late, and he hits this traffic jam, and there's a police and state troopers, and he says to the trooper, I need to get through. I'm a doctor. It's an emergency. And the trooper says, no one's getting through here. It doesn't matter what your emergency is. It's not happening. So Coles gets out of his car, and Barnaby was referencing, there's little Ruby Bridges, this, I don't know, 5 or 6 year old Black girl. And she's walking to desegregate the school in New Orleans, and surrounded by a very large crowd of white folks screaming obscenities at her and racial thing, you know, just awful stuff. And Coles thinks about this, and he calls someone he got to know, and he becomes essentially the therapist to Ruby and to other young children in the South, desegregate the South. So that's just that's that part of his life, and he becomes very involved in this, and then he goes on, and he winds up teaching at Harvard. And he winds up also being very interested in this idea of documentary studies, mindful and one of his more famous books is The Call of Stories, and the whole way that story, be it written, be it painted, any art form, Dr. Coles would argue, has information that's, you know, as he says, the social sciences are theories. They're theoretical. They're not fact. You know, we can't prove that Freud's description of the psyche is accurate. We come to use it in everyday language, you know, ego, superego, id, as though that's a fact. and you know, Cole says none of that is proven, or very little of it, and that it is in art, that story, and that can be so helpful.
Okay.
Sorry.
I want to place a marker here invite everyone to take a breath. You know, Jim, this is landing us right into the heart of story, but also the accidents that happen. Very similar to Keith Jarrett, who has to find meaning in a series of accidents. So let's put a marker there. He's at Harvard now. The Call of Stories, teaching and the moral imagination, the Call of Stories, teaching and the moral imagination. He's paying attention in the midst of everything falling apart. You know, it's like when he's paying attention to what he hears, and he's not judging it. He's taken a suggestion, maybe. He's able to take a suggestion from William Carlos Williams. He's able to pay attention and notice what's the connections that he's making, and he asks about them. If he has a thought, he doesn't stuff it, he doesn't jack it up, but he does honor it. He takes some kind of an informed action based upon what's arising up in his own act of paying attention.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
I want to make sure we don't lose you in the midst of all this.
Okay. I'm easily lost.
Yeah. Okay. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say the other thing that he does is he's working at McLean's as a psychiatrist with troubled teenagers, and these are really troubled kids. They're essentially completing high school in a psychiatric hospital, and he goes and he of course tries to get to know all of them and each of them, and nothing works. None of them will talk to him about anything of importance, and he can't. He's just, he can't get through it. And out of self-defense, one day he takes them to the Gardner Museum in Boston, and they're standing in front of a painting, and one of them says, "Gee, that reminds me exactly of my father when he did blah blah blah, and my mother," and so on and so forth. And Coles, in practice, sees the power of story. The story in this case was brought about by art into these kids being able to tell their story. And that's where his story comes.
Wow.
And there's an endless supply of, I had to pull up another chair because I've got about 30 books to reference in thinking about Dr. Coles. But, so many different things. He asked me, I was trying to finish a novel, and some friends said, you'd be great to teach Dr. Coles' course at Harvard. And I said, I'm not a teacher. And he said, oh, he'll like that. And sure enough, I went to see Dr. Coles, and I have a background in the Franciscan seminary, which he was very interested in. That was, he was a good friend of Dorothy Day's, and in fact wrote a biography of Dorothy Day. And the order I was in was close to Dorothy Day, the Franciscans. And so he made that connection right away. And we just had this lovely chat. And, he said, but here's something I was going to say about teaching with him. So he, of course, assigns me, there's 20 teachers in this course, and he assigns me to teach for the other teachers Flannery O'Connor's short stories. And I know this is my material. That is the Catholicism of it, the darkness of it, etc. And I do this, which I'm sure, is like the best presentation ever done on Flannery O'Connor. I'm sure of it. And I can feel it in the room. The room is vibrating. And afterwards, he says, Jim, that was absolutely amazing. That was one of the best things on Flannery O'Connor I've ever heard. He said, but let me ask you something. He said, you don't teach the students this way, do you? And of course I do. This is my first year. He said, oh, please don't ever teach them like that. Mindful, talk about simple mindfulness is what are you doing here, as your question asked.
What are we doing? What's really
What are we
going
doing
on
here? What are we here to tell Jim Hart how wonderful he is? No, we're here to teach these students who, stop trying to impress people with education. It was the thing, Coles was also very anti-Harvard in the sense of the academy. He wanted to be Harvard.
Yeah, I think we're on this. I think we're finding it. I think we're finding we're finding what's really going on here. So let me just add to that, or harmonize with you. You, like somebody told you, should go find Coles. You told me to go find Coles.
Mhm.
And I started teaching kids in prison on Rikers Island based on you watched me do this. Based on a curriculum that I developed as an actor and a playwright, teaching kids who are incarcerated strategies of storytelling, strategies of personal narrative, strategies of oral history. And I presented it. I was one of the fastest hires in the history of that system. Everybody, many common friends of Jim and I were looking at me going, Barnaby, you're an actor and a playwright. You're never going to get a job in the New York City Department of Education. Can you teach math? Can you teach science? And I went and read a bunch of books up in Sharon, Connecticut, and wrote this curriculum and was hired, and would periodically check in with Jim around how this was unfolding, and he would be listening and he would be encouraging me. And at one point he said, he started telling me stories about Robert Coles, so sometimes my students, these girls that I was working with, incarcerated adolescent and adult women, they would begin to tell their stories. They would and this is the phrase that I heard Coles say when I met him, telling stories about how life goes for them.
Mm.
And I began to listen to the stories that these young 16, 17, 18, and then the adult women telling me stories about how life goes for them. And I was reading Coles by then. So I knew that it was important to pay attention. And sure enough, a dismantling process began. I felt like I was going through a kind of social chemotherapy. I'd go home weeping at night around the realizations that I was making about concepts like, the prison industrial, oh yeah, I heard it. Oh, this is what it feels like. This is what it is. This is the tangible nature of it. And I was being blasted. My own my own sense of myself was being smashed. And I couldn't wait to get back to that school the next day, to be with them, and for us to be together in the context of me paying attention to them, teaching me their stories.
Right.
And I'll tell you, this is how, sometimes the younger adolescents would create pictures while they were talking. And I sent those doodles to Robert Coles. I said, I'm doing this work. We were supposed to meet at a conference in Chicago and he got sick. And so I was upset. I remember I was complaining to you about that I didn't get to meet him. And you said, so write him. And so I sent him, and he got in touch with me and said, we need to meet. We need to talk. I need to understand what's going on here with this work. And that was how I met Coles. But it was funny, Jim, because he was also a teacher to Mark Epstein, who's, if folks who know about mindfulness and meditation know, we're talking about a serious cultivator of understanding meditation in our world, in our secular world. So I want to come back to this sense of accident story. And so there we have Robert Coles, and this is one of the things we want to introduce to our participants. You know, if this were a university course, you would have done some reading on Robert Coles, you will be doing some reading on Robert Coles, and you who are here today, I just encourage you, investigate for yourself the life of this person. But Jim, you're not going to get away that easy. I mean, when I met you, you were a business executive. I didn't really know you so much in the context of Robert Coles. I knew that you were married to Carly Simon at the time. I can say that because you've written this book, Lucky Jim. And in that book, it almost seems as if you're excavating, or you're telling the story of how you had to excavate your own story to find your own, I don't know, your own, not just a moral center, but your own sort of like chelicity, you know, that these.
What's that word?
Chelicity, Chalicity. Oh, I was saving that one up. I didn't know if I was going to say it tonight.
Don't ever say that in front of someone.
Don't ever say that. Yeah, really. But these natural states that are part of nature and not part so much of civilization, but that are part of the natural world, a sense of how we share this practice of paying attention with all living beings or creatures, animals. And so here we are in culture crisis, climate crisis. But you seem to be, you correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a story about how you bring mindfulness to the crisis that you feel you need to stay with and pay attention to, which you tell about in this book. Can you, am I onto something here, or am I completely?
Well, I don't, you are completely, but that's another story. I don't know. That is let me just
Okay, while you're doing that, let me just preface something.
Yeah.
Things are falling apart. I feel in our world, people are trying to figure out what's the next thing. What do I do here?
Mhm.
Because I don't know, we don't know who we are. Things are falling apart. Where are we going to look? Where are we going to see? A lot of people are being tempted to react mindlessly to the situation. And some people are looking at their stories to find out and figure out who they need to be, what they need to live into.
I'm gonna use that.
Okay.
The answer, I think, in some ways is, and the answer about my book, Double Take, every issue of Double Take had the poem by Seamus Heaney in the front of the page.
Wow.
Of the book.
Yeah.
And that's where the title of Double Take comes from. And I'm only going to read the last two stanzas of the poem. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. That double take of meaning that we, and now I'll go to my book. I knew the story of my life, I thought. I was a pretty bright guy. I knew what had happened. And then I started writing the memoir, and I realized I didn't know what the story of my life was. I had to do a double take, a constant double take, in order to get at what the meaning of my life was. Some people think the meaning of my life, and how could it possibly be that, what are the key moments of my life? I didn't really understand one of the key moments of my life was the death of my best friend in the seminary when I was 15 years old. It's a key moment. It changed my life entirely. Not to mention how coming from my parents is the greatest accident of life for all of us. We could have come from anybody's, but here we are with two strangers in a certain way into the world. And then and again, it all seems like accident. I'm sure it seems mostly for all of us like accidents. I meet my wife, Carly, on a train. I don't know who she is. She's on a train. We fall in love. It's enormous, wildly romantic, extraordinarily unlikely, and probably not the best way to meet your spouse, but that's how it happened. And then the underlying issues, the double take. So here I'm struggling with sexual identity throughout my life, and in certain ways, I don't even know it. Because I think I'm sort of the bellwether of sexuality. You should sort of really like women and really like men. And so what the hell? I figure that's normal. That's me. That's me. It must be normal. I mean, that's the kind of world I kind of created. Anyway, so looking at all of it and coming up, and then, my severely handicapped son, these things are mind-boggling in terms of how we handle the lives and the struggles that we have, how any of us survive them all. Then my addiction, alcoholism, and drugs. As I look at it, it's mind-boggling. And then if you're Dr. Coles, I bring him back in. Mm-hmm. You start the course of the literature of social reflection with "Let Us Now Praise Famous Men," that
was the name of the course?
No. That was the first book that was read in the course.
Okay, sorry.
And of course, if you read that book, it's a most unusual, idiosyncratic book, about sharecroppers in the South. Boy, my life is a cakewalk. These people are living and this is, by the way, the importance of documentary studies, so that Jim Hart, who came from a completely different way, thinking I'm poor, or not rich in a working class family in New York. Well, now transport me to this place in Alabama, and I'm like, wow, holy mackerel. I had no idea. I mean, I had an idea, but what James Agee does is he gives you every detail of what that Southern life might be like. And, it begins to blow off the doors of our assumptions. It's a very powerful book and a very complex book. Mm-hmm. But, it was the civil rights workers in the South in the 60s, they had that book in their back pockets. It was a very popular book for kids and students in the civil rights movement. Anyway, that all said, and then I write this memoir, and of course, what I can say about it is it's as truthful as I could have been at the time. Right. When I look back now, I think, I could have said a little more about this or that or the other thing, but
right.
But I'll brag just a tiny bit. What I can say about it as an achievement is it's a much better book than I could have written, and that to me is a really wonderful place in terms of achievement. And that's the reason it's better is because I had a village of people helping me write it, or a city, as I say. But anyway, but we all have these, I just came from this writing group that we're doing, and they're all people of very disparate experience trying to get at the truth of their lives. And it's such interesting, elusive and work, and then you capture the story, and then you lose it a little, and then you capture it again. And, you know, it's remarkable to see, and also that it took me 7 years at least to write my memoir, you know, and of course writers say, oh, that's not very long, you know, real right, you know, whereas and I get it, because it's the life that you're living, and the life that you haven't lived, and all sorts of ways of thinking about it. But the mindfulness about our experience is really important, really, really important.
I have to say, I'm aware that we have people here who may be having some thoughts, some connections of their own that they're making, finding ways into this. Again, the way we are setting this up, and how Tracy and I are learning to set this up, is to really use the chat as a way for people to check in. But we also give and invite people, and would do this theoretically as we begin to learn and grow how to, because we're going to do this cycle again. And I'll be doing this cycle again and again and again. Part of why this is happening is somebody encouraged you to check in with Robert Coles. I was encouraged to check in with Martin Harwood, who was the director of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum for some years, who wanted to be honest about paying attention to the story of Enola Gay and the story of the atom bomb, which many people in the Republican Party and in the American Legion did not want attention being paid to that. And which brings up a sense of the risk. He was also my mentor at Cornell University. So he invited me to start thinking about teaching a series or a course at universities. So I'm not willing or ready to do that. But if I were, it would involve things like this. And so I'm trying to find this. Now, let me just say to the folks, part of what your assignment, if you wish to accept it, is to think about how this resonates with you. What's coming up for you as you hear this? I don't know everybody, but I see a couple familiar faces. I certainly know Hector Montenegro, who has done some incredible work in education. I just want to put that out there. I'm not throwing anybody under the bus or calling out anybody's spot. I'm just saying this is something we want to be aware of, is that we're having this conversation together. Now, Jim, you know, listening to you and thinking about the challenges of an educator in public education in this country, where we have children coming in with really knowing that they must find their identity, knowing that they have a lot of options now. They can identify themselves as he, she, we, they, you know, and understanding what that means and the rights of the LGBTQ community. There is, you know, and then the sense of tension around that, the backlash against that, the need to, you know, there's this, it's hard to pay attention to your story. It's hard to be true to the things that are truthfully rising up in you, telling you, giving you a sense of what the action needs to be. It's part of the reason why I'm creating this, is like, what are the actions that compel us as individuals and as a community to take action around, to change the conditions of our lives, or maybe to adapt or attune ourselves in a way that's more truthful to what's happening in our world. So at this point, I just want to open up space, see if there's anybody who has a question for Jim, or has an observation, or has a wondering, or just has something that just needs to be said. You know, I would say that every time a bunch of people get together, and if I just look at these, 11 squares, you know, there's always a conversation that wants to happen when people get together. It's our job to find the conversation and have it. What do we need to hear tonight to make sure we have this conversation around this concept of mindfulness, story, action, and reflection? I invite you to unmute and tell us what you think, what you feel. Or not.
I feel nothing.
You know, that's the teacher's technique. The teacher says the silence, the empty space of silence comes up, and the frightened teacher has to fill that up with something, and the other teacher just looks at the students and says, I can wait. We have plenty of time. Now,
I do want to say that there's nothing I've said tonight that is what I prepared for. So
I feel like I'm hitting Tracy. Now, Tracy is also excellent because she's also good. Are you feeling like we're in the container of the ethos of the Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully? Or are we way? What do you think, Tracy?
No, we're certainly there. I mean, I'm reflecting on my own life as we talk, and what that would feel like to really dig in for 7 years and do my memoir. And I'm thinking, I don't know if I like going back to some of the events in my life and reactivating that. And yeah, I can see how you say you when you said you lose it and then you catch it again. And I feel like that would all maybe also happen emotionally too. And I really appreciate you tying in like little teacher anecdotes as well.
I would offer this, you know, one of the connections I made was that when I started practicing mindfulness with students and with teachers or with people anywhere, you'd have the mindfulness practice. What's the next thing that organically happens? People begin to tell their stories to one another. And I remember I was training with the great Tibetan teacher, a student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Judy Leaf. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Judy Leaf, an incredible woman and incredible teacher of meditation. And she would often say, well, now would be a good time for us to tell our stories to one another about what we're experiencing when we're practicing and we're listening to each other's experience. And it seems hard. It seems like it's very hard for people to simultaneously hold to the truth of their story and pay attention to the truth of other people's stories. You know, I'm thinking of a pluralistic society where we're able to tolerate and accept many truths all at the same time and make space for that. So I made that connection.
well, there are endless connections in
Just Constance, if you
Sorry.
want to, I'm sorry, Jim. Constance, if you want to say something, feel free.
Yeah, I just have a quick story.
Yeah.
A quick story of tying in what you were talking about, schools and et cetera. I come from a long line of actually well-educated I'm the fourth generation of women in my family with a college degree. I have a master's degree. I have the lesser degree of all of them. Now, there's a certain thing that happens when you have that kind of extreme. There's not an emotional thing happening here. So just saying that. I, being me and somewhat of an out of the box person, did not want to go to an Ivy League college, et cetera. Following your stories. So I applied to this school. I was supposed to go to a Catholic school though. So I found this school in St. Louis, Missouri that was totally out of the box, Jacqueline Grennan and all this type of thing. And because of my grades, et cetera, I was put on this program of 13 of us who were part of this Harvard study, which I only found out about much later. But the point of it being that I had a real I had a real negative or issue. I could not speak in front of a group of people. I couldn't even, if it was memorizing a word, even like French or something, I couldn't. And so nobody said anything to me. Nobody discussed it, nobody anything. But Professor Duddington would say, well, Constance, you like Greek history, just take a minute or two and do this. Anyway, without going through the whole story, it's just about how you meet somebody in life. There's a connection. And by the end of this, he had somehow gotten me through the, I don't even know the word you would call it, but my inability or desire not to be seen, not to talk in front of a group. And nobody ever said anything to me. In retrospect, I figured out that he had worked with me and I must have been part of their study or something. I have no idea. So it's the aspect of how things happen in life accidentally, but you don't figure it out in the moment, but in retrospect, it changed my life. And by virtue of that, today, when I'm like, they will kid me, with dealing with workers and a lot of teaching management, they would say she could reach anybody, she can talk to anybody. Not true. It's a connection that was formed over time, which is what you're talking about. An accident.
An
Mhm.
accident.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. This is very inspiring to me, this
And-
conversation.
And mindfulness of the accidents. It's when Bob Coles asked me to be I was in the magazine business, and Coles started the literary journal Double Take, a photographic literary magazine. And I wanted nothing to do with it. I knew it couldn't survive. So I'm in the airport somewhere, and I call him. And he had called me, and I called him from the airport. And he said, Jim, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm just about to take a new job. I'm going to be the chairman of a .com company in Seattle. And he said, oh, I was just going to ask you to be the CEO of Double Take. And I said, oh, Bob, I said, there's nothing more I'd like to do than that. And he said, Jim, I'm a psychiatrist. I said, yes. He said, did you hear what you said? He said, I think you're going to have to do this. And I went and did it. But that's the accident of it all. And then he made me aware that I said something that I actually believed. There was nothing I would rather do than this thing. And we didn't last we lasted another 4 years or so, but that was a big achievement, lasting those 4 years, things of value in this culture, But the mindfulness of it all is real. And the mindfulness of other people's abilities, potentials, realities, the other. Coles is always talking about the other.
Yes.
Not about me. That's what I'm trying to get away from. I'm trying to understand the other so that I can be in the world in this new and different way. And he was just brilliant with that. And so, anyway.
Yeah, we are heading towards the end. I can't say I'm fully 100% satisfied. On the other hand, isn't that the story of paying attention as well? There's what you want when you want it, and there's this idea of what you think, and then there's what unfolds. I'm glad we're recording this. I'll be able to go back to this, and so will you, to think what was the thought that was, so now we have a little bit of an artifact that we can refer back to. And Tracy might tell us some of the ways in which you can do that and respond and see the first recording. Double take of feeling, double take of meaning, stories you go into your story so that you can live out from it and into the story of the other. You know, the literature of social reflection, and C. Wright Mills, I think of, the great social scientist who talked about, you know, the sign of a thriving democracy is when the private individual can translate personal struggle and personal suffering into public identification of a common issue that requires action.
Well, you you remind me. So in this course, the literature of social reflection, we read, it's a reading list of like 50 of the greatest books ever written and so on. And it's impossible. No one should have to take this course. It's way too much reading. But so the last lecture that Bob gives, we've had all this heavy thinking. There's the philosophy, the literature. Well, it's just astounding. And so he says, well, his last paragraph of the semester, it says, well, I guess what I would take away from what we've done is, well, be a better citizen, be a better husband, be a better father, be a better wife, be a better friend. I think that's it. We just pass each other on to another. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the course. That was his conclusion of this astounding work. So
That's brilliant.
well, what you're expecting out of this event, it's like, who knows?
I feel that we've hit the goal now. I feel that you just brought us. That's why I always love being a friend of Jim Hart. And by the time I'm finished talking to him, I feel that my problem has been solved, at least for one day.
Right.
But Jim, thank you.
Thank you.
Be a better person, be a better teacher. Maybe that's the connection of mindfulness and the moral imagination, is open up to the possibility of what that means to you and how the guidance for that comes through paying attention to your story and the story of others. What's most frustrating are all the things that I think about that I want to say, and then not something else is said and you miss it. But we have this, and I think the next step would be to ask Tracy to maybe talk a little bit about how folks who might want to can respond. But if there were an assignment, or if I were going to invite you, and we have had some people do this, or even for yourself, just to take away is, I hope that it raises awareness of all of us that our stories are far more than we think they are, and they have far more power in them for all kinds of things than we think they do. And maybe the only way we can get to that is if we can pay attention to them a little more in a better way. The big thing for students is attentional focus. And so we have flirting with the US Department of Education is seeing that mindfulness also helps a lot of kids to develop attentional focus, the ability to stay with a difficult thing. So there's more and more and more to be discovered. It's coming into my head and then it floats away as soon as I try to grab it to say it. So I think that means we're supposed to move towards good night ourselves. And thank you, Jim. You definitely helped me shed light on this. The reason we wanted to create this was not to teach people how to practice mindfulness, but to begin to think about what is mindfulness for at this particular moment in our world.
Yeah, well, there you get into the moral imagination, which is something we haven't even really discussed specifically. Moral inquiry and moral imagination, and that's a whole other law.
Maybe you've given us the next topic. I really, I'm so glad that I got to be able to spend time with you, my brother, and to see
Thank you.
old friends.
Thank you very much.
And so feel free, folks, to think about when or to take some time to see what your connection is to this conversation tonight. And I hope that it informs some kind of action that you take to become a better citizen. And that'll certainly be one of the topics that we'll be having in this series. So it all resonates. Is there anything I've missed? That's the real question.
Oh, couldn't be anything.
Besides everything. In that case, let me say thank you. And it's 8:08. And this is here, Tracy, right? This is live. You can come back to this. You don't have, this doesn't have to be a one-off if you don't want it to be.
Yeah, I wanted to share that we do have a space on, we call it our member site. It's within the Mighty Networks community building platform. And I'm just going to put a link in the chat if you want to join us there. So we put all the recordings of our learning sessions in the Learning Center area of that member site. But we've also created a special group within that member site for people who are have come to one or more of these Praxis series sessions. And then we're having conversations there. If Barnaby gives us an optional assignment, you can share it there. Or if you're like me and you're laying in bread that tonight and all of a sudden that's when things to share come to you. And
yeah, I think the assignment would be is what's the story that you've had to refer to when you needed to enact change in your life? Is there one particular story from your own direct, valid experience of life that when you were facing your lucky Jim moment, or when you were facing your Robert Cole's moment with Ruby Bridges, what's the accident, the story that rose out of an accident in your life that defined a major path in your life? I think that would be the assignment. Jim, what do you think about that as an assignment?
I don't like assignments. I don't do homework.
Perfect answer. And I think that this idea of, you know, because Jim, you brought up accident and paying attention in the midst of that accident and the story of meaning that unfolds from that.
Sure.
So something like that.
Yeah.
Good luck
Anyway,
with that. Good luck with that. That's what he's saying.
Thank you. Thank you. No, it's just, there's so much material that I can hardly, you know.
Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Tracy, for the work that you do.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everyone who came.
thank you. And I put a little in the chat. I shared what book that was that Jim was talking about from that Harvard class, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And someone else had asked me what they forgot the name of your book. So I shared personally with them, Lucky Jim. But earlier up there, I shared a Simon and Schuster link that goes right to it.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that. And that link I shared regarding the membership and our member site, in the second paragraph, there's a little link that says, click here for a full financial aid scholarship. So we just work with everybody's budgets. We have over 1,000 professional members. Most are educators, but not everybody. But we just,
That's terrific.
Yeah, we just most are on scholarship. So we invite you to join us however you can. That way, it's going to be great to see. Hopefully, some of your faces here next month.
It's got great resources for all kinds of ways, but there you have it. Was there anything else that you wanted to say, Tracy?
No, I'm good. Do you want to close us out with a few breaths together?
Well, I would just say, you know, we can cap it. It doesn't take much, you know, it's just a moment where you could just pause, hit the pause button. Take a moment, breathe into your body. Stay with that sense of the breath. When you inhale, it's taking you in to your story, into your truth, what's true for you in this moment. And the sense of the inhale or the exhale being the moving out from that truth into becoming a better citizen in the world. We go in to touch that truth. We go out to see what happens next. And that's it. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you on the trail.
Thanks.
To be continued.
And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Constance.
And peace out.
Peace out.
Peace out. Bye, Tracy.